Ethan arrived at the house just as dusk began bleeding into the sky, casting the aging Victorian structure in shadow. It loomed at the end of a narrow, root-cracked path, half smothered by ivy and the silence of a place that had long stopped expecting company. The air smelled of old wood, faint mold, and something subtly metallic, like blood left too long to dry. He hadn't seen his Aunt Miriam in years, not since the incident no one talked about. Her will had named him sole heir, which was strange. His relationship with her had always been distant, formal. Still, the inheritance seemed a gift, until he stepped over the threshold and the air shifted. He felt it instantly. Not a chill, exactly, but a pressure, like the house was adjusting to him, acknowledging his arrival with a held breath. The hallway stretched straight from the front door, dim even with the overhead light on. The wallpaper was a faded green damask, peeling at the corners like it had grown tired of holding itself up. Framed family photos lined the walls, but Ethan noticed something odd. No matter where he stood, none of the faces ever looked directly at him. And then there was the clock. The grandfather clock stood sentry at the end of the hallway, tall and black with brass trim, its face covered in a warped, cloudy glass. It hadn't ticked when he first arrived, just stood there, silently brooding. That changed at midnight. The house had been quiet for hours. Ethan had unpacked a little, wandered the creaking halls, and tried to ignore the way the walls groaned like they were breathing in sleep. He was just about to head to bed when the chimes began. Gong. He paused, halfway up the stairs. Gong. A second chime. Midnight. He counted automatically. 3, 4, then 8, 10, 11, 12. He waited for silence. Instant gong. The 13th chime was different, heavier. It rang out deeper than the others, almost vibrating the floor beneath him. The lights in the hallway flickered. Something crashed behind him. Ethan turned just in time to see a porcelain vase, one that had been sitting on a hallway table, shatter on the floor. No one had touched it. No breeze, no earthquake. It had leapt, as if startled. And then he saw the portrait. It was his aunt's, her formal painting in the parlor. He'd passed it earlier, vaguely noting how dour and still she looked. But now her mouth was curved upward. A smile, crooked, wrong, and unmistakably recent. He stumbled back, heart hammering. The air around him felt wrong, warmer, then colder, then nothing at all. The clock ticked once, then stopped. Somewhere deep in the house, a floorboard creaked, not like settling wood, but a footstep. Deliberate, slow. Ethan didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the guest room, eyes fixed on the hallway, listening to the silence and waiting for it to breathe again. The next night, Ethan told himself it had been a trick of the light, a coincidence, grief mixed with stress. Maybe the old house was just trying to scare him, and maybe it was working, but he wasn't going to lose it over a broken vase and a creepy painting. Still, as midnight approached, a crawling sensation returned, an instinct he couldn't shake, like the house was leaning in to whisper something to him. He tried reading in the living room, but the words wouldn't stick. He ended up standing in the hallway again, drawn by some magnetic dread. The grandfather clock sat dormant. Its hands showed 11:59, though he was sure it had been midnight just minutes ago. The silence stretched so long it became a sound in itself, a low hum under his skin. Then, gong. The first chime landed in his chest. He felt it more than heard it. Gong! Each toll came slower than the last, each one sinking the house deeper into shadow. Ethan counted 12 came as expected. But the 13th, it came like thunder. This time, the chime wasn't just sound. It shimmered. The hallway wavered at the edges of his vision, like the air had turned liquid. The clock groaned, not ticking, but breathing. The floor trembled beneath him, faint but unmistakable. And then, with a sound like cracking bone, the wall behind the clock split. A seam widened slowly, impossibly. The paneling peeled back like paper, revealing rotted wood, and in the center a door emerged. Narrow, wooden, ancient. There were no hinges, no knob, just a single iron handle, cold to the touch. It hadn't been there before. He was certain. His fingers trembled as he reached for the handle, half hoping it wouldn't budge. But it turned with a soft click and opened without resistance. Inside was a hallway. Not his hallway. This one was smaller, suffocatingly narrow, the walls a dark red that pulsed ever so slightly, as if breathing. The ceiling pressed low, and a sickly yellow light flickered from nowhere. The air was thick and sweet with a scent Ethan hadn't smelled since he was a child. Warm dog fur, pine needles, and faintly, popcorn? He stepped inside. The door didn't close behind him. It simply disappeared. At the end of the narrow hall was a door with familiar peeling paint, a pale blue, its handle wrapped in a frayed red ribbon. Ethan's chest tightened. That was his childhood bedroom door. He opened it and stepped into a room that shouldn't exist. It was his. Down to the crooked bookshelf, the faded astronaut poster on the closet, the dent in the nightstand where he'd once thrown a flashlight during a tantrum. Every detail was perfect, except for one. There, curled up on the bed, was a dog. His dog, Bentley, a golden retriever, gone more than 10 years now. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Bentley lifted his head slowly and looked at him. Same honey brown eyes, same graying snout. Bentley, he whispered. The dog barked once, softly, like a memory, and then he was gone. Not like he ran, not like he vanished, like he'd never been there at all. The bed was made. The room was dustless, empty, and colder than before. Ethan backed out of the room, heart racing, mind unraveling. The hallway behind him warped as he moved, elongating, reshaping. He ran. When he burst back into the real hallway, the grandfather clock stood still. Its hands now read 12:01. The wooden door behind it? Gone, as if it had never existed. But Ethan could still smell it, pine needles, dog fur, and the faintest trace of something burning. And the clock, just before he turned away, ticked once. Just once. Ethan didn't leave the house the next day, not out of laziness, but fear. The world outside the window seemed thinner, like painted glass over something worse. The strange hallway behind the clock had vanished again, but the memory of it clung to him. The smell, the silence, and the impossible image of Bentley, alive for a single heartbeat. That night, as the sky sank into a bruised blue, he sat in the hallway, waiting. The grandfather clock stood tall and silent, its hands frozen at 11:59, as if reluctant to move. Ethan didn't bother checking his phone anymore. Its time kept slipping out of sync, skipping backward, looping minutes. Once, it counted 12 seconds in a row, all labeled 12 o'clock. He waited in the silence until dong. He didn't flinch this time. Wrong. He closed his eyes and counted, steadying his breath. The chimes came slower, heavier, like they were pulling something loose from beneath the floorboards of the house. 12. 13. The clock's casing let out a long, cracking sigh. And once again, the door appeared. The narrow wooden slab unfolded from the wall, like a memory clawing its way back into the present. Ethan opened it and stepped inside, heart thrumming in his chest. The hallway within had changed again, longer now, its walls lined with heavy red drapes and windows that looked out onto nothing but static black. He walked until he came to a new door. It was pale green, the paint bubbled with age. No number, just a brass handle, cold as bone. When he pushed it open, the smell hit him first. Lilacs, her perfume. The room was a kitchen, his kitchen, but not this house. It was the one from his childhood home, down to the sunflower magnets on the fridge and the yellow checkered curtains. The light was warm, the hum of the refrigerator steady. It was comforting, familiar. And then he saw her. At the sink, her back to him, stood a woman in a soft blue sweater. She was washing dishes, slowly, rhythmically. She turned at the sound of his breath. It was his mother, or someone wearing her. She looked exactly as she did the day before the accident. The same warm eyes, the same tired smile. Her voice, when it came, was soft and pleasant. "Oh, there you are. Hungry?" Ethan's legs nearly gave out. "Mom?" She frowned, confused. "Sweetheart, what are you talking about?" He stepped closer. Her hands were damp from the dishwater. She reached out and touched his face, just like she used to, gently brushing his hair back from his forehead. But her eyes didn't recognize him. Not truly. And her hands were too cold. "Mom, it's me, Ethan," he whispered. "You died. I saw you. I was there." Her face began to ripple. First, subtly, like heat rising from pavement. Then more violently, as if her features were melting in slow, pulsing waves. The mouth twisted too wide. The eyes darkened. The skin beneath her left eye began to slide, revealing something slick and wrong beneath. She gripped his wrist. Her voice dropped 2 octaves. "You shouldn't be here." Ethan yanked back, heart slamming against his ribs. The kitchen darkened as if someone had flipped a switch. The walls cracked. The air filled with a high-pitched ringing. He stumbled back into the hallway, the door slamming shut behind him on its own. The hallway had changed again. No longer lined with drapes, the walls now curved inward like a throat. The floor beneath him pulsed, once, then twice. The light above flickered red. And far behind him, somewhere in the dark, came a sound he couldn't bear to hear again. Footsteps. Slow, measured, familiar. He ran, twisting through the impossible corridor, until the wooden door returned in front of him. He threw it open and hurled himself into the real hallway. His lungs burned. The door was gone. The clock ticked once, but the hallway outside the hidden door had changed. It was longer. The shadows reached farther. The light bulbs above flickered, and the floor slanted ever so slightly, as if the house had shifted while he was gone. And down the hall, just beyond the staircase, One of the portraits had fallen off the wall. The glass had shattered, and beneath it, someone had added a new face. His mother. But her eyes were closed, and her smile was still rippling. By the fourth night, Ethan had stopped trying to convince himself this was grief, trauma, or just a house full of strange drafts and bad memories. He knew something was happening, something alive. But knowing didn't make it easier. The hallway now felt alert, like it listened, like it watched. The air seemed denser after midnight, and no matter how many lights he turned on, shadows still moved in corners that should have been still. And then there were the portraits. He hadn't paid much attention to them before. Dozens of family photos lined the hallway, sepia-toned ancestors with stiff collars and lifeless eyes, dusty frames with nameplates that had long since faded. They'd always unnerved him, but now they seemed to shift ever so slightly when he passed, like faces turning in his peripheral vision. And then one night, just before the 13th chime, he saw her. At first, it didn't register. His eye caught a detail that didn't belong in a familiar old photo of his parents' wedding. A woman in the back row. Pale skin. Dark eyes. No smile. She wasn't supposed to be there. He stared harder, convinced it was just a trick of the light. But then he moved to the next photo, a blurry shot of his aunt holding baby Ethan in the garden. And there she was again. Closer. Watching. Ethan moved quickly from frame to frame, cold sweat rising up his neck. In each one, she appeared, always in the background, always facing the camera, always closer. The clock began to chime. Gong. His heart pounded with each slow, booming strike. Gong. The air thickened. The walls pulsed like they were breathing in time with the clock. Gong. And then she moved. He saw it, clearly, undeniably. In one photo, her eyes turned while he was looking. Her head tilted. Her lips curled into a soft, crooked smile. The 13th chime rang out like a scream. Ethan stumbled back as the frame nearest him shattered on its own. The glass exploded outward. He shielded his face, staggering into the hallway wall. And then he heard the whisper, right beside his ear. Ethan James Ward. He turned slowly. The woman from the portraits stood at the end of the hallway, no longer trapped behind glass. She was real, tangible, wearing a tattered black dress that seemed soaked in shadows. Her eyes were wide and void black, pupils shaped like keyholes. Her face was wrong, not monstrous, but off, like a mask mimicking familiarity. She took a single step toward him. Ethan blinked, and she was gone. The hallway was empty. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock, which hadn't moved in months. He backed away slowly, unsure if he'd imagined it, until he saw the final proof. On the wall beside the stairs was a new photograph, one he didn't recognize. It showed the hallway. This hallway, empty, except for one figure. Him, standing near the clock. And behind him, blurred but unmistakable, the woman in black, reaching out her hand. Ethan no longer slept at night. Each hour felt like a countdown, and each minute ticked against the back of his neck like a second hand made of ice. He paced. He wrote things down just to prove to himself that his mind hadn't cracked completely. But every page of notes ended differently than he remembered writing it. Some had handwriting that wasn't his. Others contained phrases in languages he didn't speak. He had to know if it was real, if it was all real. So he set up a camera. It was an old camcorder he found boxed in the attic, tucked behind crates labeled Aunt Mara, Do Not Open. He didn't want to know what else she had locked away. He dusted off the lens, checked the battery, and positioned it directly across from the grandfather clock. If he was hallucinating, he'd finally see it. And if he wasn't, he hit record just before midnight and sat beside it, journal in hand, eyes fixed on the clock. Tick, 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 gong. The first chime sounded like a death knell, the kind they ring at sea when a ship has disappeared. Ethan sat frozen, counting. 10, 11, 12. The 13th came slower, deeper, reverberating through the house like a tremor. The hallway seemed to breathe in. The door appeared again, silently, like it had always been there. But Ethan stayed put. The camcorder's red light blinked softly. He didn't move until the door disappeared again. Then he hit stop. In the morning, sunlight barely filtered through the curtains. His eyes burned from staying awake. He plugged the camcorder into his laptop and played the footage. At first, everything looked normal. The hallway, the clock, the quiet night. He fast-forwarded through the early chimes. Then, at the moment the 13th chime should have rung, the screen flickered, once, then twice. The image warped like an old VHS tape stretched too tight. The sound cut out. Then came static. But behind the noise, something else. A voice. Several, layered over one another, whispering backward. He reversed the audio. It wasn't just noise. The whisper said, "The 13th hour is hungry. You opened the door. Now you are part of the mechanism." The footage ended in a frame of pure black. But when Ethan paused the clip, he saw something else. A single frame, just one of himself, standing in front of the clock. Except it wasn't from last night. It was him, much younger. Maybe 10. He wore the soccer jersey he'd had when he was a kid. And in the background, a shadow moved behind the hallway wall, something long-limbed and smiling. That afternoon, Ethan left the house for the first time in days. He just needed to breathe, see people. He walked 2 blocks to the coffee shop on the corner and ordered something hot, just to have warmth in his hands. But when he tried to pay, the barista frowned. "We haven't seen you in weeks." "What? I was here a few days ago." She stared at him, confused. "You came in on the 4th. Today's the 13th. Ethan blinked. No, it's not. It's the 6th. I have the calendar." He pulled out his phone. The date flashed. April 13th. A full week had passed. But in the house, he'd only lived 5 nights. Time outside the house was moving differently. Or worse, he was. And as he left the shop, his reflection in the window did not walk in sync with him. It paused half a second too long. And in the flicker of motion, he swore it smiled. By the 6th night, Ethan had accepted that whatever this was, this house, this time-shifted nightmare, wasn't a figment of his imagination. He could feel the pull of it now, like invisible hands around his ribs, urging him toward certain rooms, certain places. The house knew him, recognized his fear, and seemed to delight in it. He'd seen things, too many things. The clock chimed again. But this time, something new had happened. When the 13th chime faded into the oppressive stillness of the house, a new map had appeared on the wall of the hallway, scrawled in shaky ink. It wasn't the first time he'd found a map, but this one was different, distorted, like the lines of the house were stretched and pulled out of shape. And there, at the very top of the map, in the spidery script, was a single word: attic. His heart skipped. He hadn't dared venture to the attic. The air around the stairwell to it always felt heavier, suffocating. He knew what it meant. The attic was where memories went to die, forgotten and left behind in the dark. But now he couldn't ignore it. The house was calling him there. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat and grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer. The air was colder as he approached the stairs. The floorboards groaned beneath him, the creak far too loud in the silence. He ascended the narrow stairs to the attic door, which had never opened before, not without a struggle and not without a sudden chill in the air. He stood in front of it, breathing shallowly. The door opened with a deep, echoing scrape. Inside was worse than he imagined. The attic was vast, the space stretching beyond what should have been possible. The rafters were low, and the air smelled of dust and something more acrid. The floor was covered in boxes, all of them covered in thick cobwebs that fluttered in the breeze, as if something had recently moved through. He started to search, but as his feet sank into the dust, something glinted in the far corner, a flash of something pale beneath the dark layers of forgotten cloth. It was a wooden casket. The casket had his name on it. His hands trembled as he approached it, 1,000 memories flashing through his mind, none of them good. A dark feeling crawled up his spine, and the shadows in the attic grew, twisting toward him like hungry fingers. He had to open it. With a deep, shuddering breath, he lifted the lid. Inside was himself, his own body. It was so still, so unnaturally still. He didn't understand it. The body was exactly like him, exactly. Same face, same clothes. But there was something off about it. The skin was waxy, almost translucent, like it had been drained of life. The hands were cold, stiff in an unnatural pose, clutched tightly around something. A broken key. His body, his dead body, held onto that key like it was a lifeline. The air felt thick, pressing against his chest. Ethan's mind screamed for him to close the casket, to run, to leave the attic, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the body. The sheer wrongness of it paralyzed him. His hands hovered above the corpse, but the closer he got, the more alive it seemed. His heart raced. He reached out. Just as his fingers brushed the key, the room around him shifted. The walls seemed to bend. The air seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a rock. The floor trembled beneath his feet. The attic, no, the entire house shifted. He heard a voice, soft at first, a whisper in the back of his mind. Not from the body, from behind him, from the walls, from the attic itself. You shouldn't have opened it. The voice echoed in a language he knew but couldn't understand. And then the house screamed. The floorboards cracked, splintering beneath his feet as a shadow, black and swirling, formless, rose from the casket. It coiled upward like smoke, tendrils reaching out, whispering his name in a voice that sounded like 1,000 voices in one. He stepped back, panic rising, heart pounding in his throat. He spun, running toward the door. But the attic door was gone. The walls pulsed, and the air grew thick, with an unbearable pressure. The shadows around him moved, twisting into forms, reaching, pulling him back toward the casket. His body, remained motionless in the casket, the broken key still clutched tightly in its hands. But the presence was there, alive in the room, alive with the same thing that had haunted the house from the beginning. It had been waiting for him. Ethan slammed his fists against the walls, desperate to find an escape. The house, the attic, it wouldn't let him go. And just as quickly as it began, the pressure stopped. The shadows vanished. The attic door reappeared. Ethan stumbled backward, gasping for air. His legs gave out beneath him. He barely managed to crawl out of the attic, the door slamming shut behind him. But when he looked down at his hands, fingers covered in dust, trembling with fear, he noticed something else. In the palm of his right hand, there was a faint, identical imprint of a key. He closed his fist around it. Ethan had no idea how much longer he could last in the house. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Every room felt like it had a life of its own, like they were breathing, pulsing with something he couldn't see but could feel in his very bones. Even in the daylight, when the sun pierced the heavy curtains with sharp, painful light, the shadows never seemed to recede. They lurked at the edges of every room, curling around corners, hiding behind furniture, waiting, watching. And through it all, the 13th chime grew more oppressive, more demanding. It felt like a countdown, one he couldn't stop. Ethan spent hours combing through his aunt's things in a desperate attempt to understand what was happening. He scoured the house for answers, for anything that could explain the madness. He knew something was buried here, something buried deep within the walls, in the very foundation of the house itself. His Aunt Mara had been eccentric. He'd known that much. But as he dug through boxes of old letters, dusty photo albums, and forgotten keepsakes, he began to suspect that her eccentricities had been a lot more than mere oddities. They were warnings. There were journals, stacks of them, bound in cracked leather, some so old the pages seemed to disintegrate when he touched them. They were written in Mara's meticulous, looping script, pages filled with rambling thoughts about time, about memories, about feeding the clock. Each journal spoke of a strange pact, one tied to the house itself and to the old grandfather clock in the hallway. He flipped through page after page, his eyes scanning the cryptic notes, trying to make sense of the jumbled words and half-finished thoughts. One entry caught his eye. To feed the clock is to feed the house. I feed it my memories, my flesh, my soul. In return, it gives me time. Time to keep the house locked away. Time to keep it from coming through. His pulse quickened. It didn't make sense, but it felt right. He flipped ahead, desperate for more. The 13th chime is the key. When it strikes, the house remembers. It remembers what was, what could have been, and what never should have been. It remembers me, and it will remember you. Time is a cruel thing. Ethan, don't open the door. The words on the page blurred as his eyes stung. He quickly wiped his face, trying to focus, but his heart was pounding so loudly in his ears that he couldn't think straight. Don't open the door. He had already opened it. Another journal entry appeared, hastily scrawled. I stopped feeding it. I want to see what it really is. I want to know what happens when time is no longer bound. When the door opens, the rest of the page was a smear of ink, as if Mara had been interrupted mid-sentence. The chilling thought hit him hard. His aunt had known what was coming. She had known exactly what she was dealing with, and she'd stopped feeding the clock. Her final entry, barely legible, read, "I'll never be able to leave, but you can. Ethan, it has already begun." He put the journal down, the words spinning in his head. Had Mora known that the house was alive? That it was feeding on time? That every chime, every twist of reality was a calculated part of the house hunger? It didn't seem possible. Yet her words were a warning, and he had failed to listen. He had opened the door, and now the clock was counting down. He picked up another journal and flipped it open, hoping for a clearer understanding of what had happened. But what he found made his blood run cold. The journal described the clock's origins, how it had been built by a man who disappeared under strange circumstances, leaving behind nothing but a cryptic note that read, "The clock was never meant to be opened." The clock had been constructed to keep something trapped inside, something ancient, something powerful. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. It wasn't just memories that had been trapped behind the clock's ticking. It was something else. Something that shouldn't exist in this world at all. Time itself. But now that Mara had stopped feeding it, now that the door was open, time was beginning to unravel. And whatever was locked away, whatever had been waiting behind the clock, was clawing its way back into reality. Ethan sat back on the floor, the journal clutched tightly in his hands. The house was shifting again. He could feel it in the very walls, the air around him thickening. He could hear the distant sound of the clocks ticking growing louder, more insistent. Every second felt like an eternity. The door behind him, the one that led into the hallway, into the darkness, seemed to be pulling him toward it. It was time. The house had changed again. Ethan could feel it even as he stood in the hallway, the air now thick with something new, something ancient. The walls felt closer, like they were leaning in, listening to his every movement. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind, every echo of footsteps on the stairs seemed to reverberate with a deeper meaning now. The house wasn't just alive, it was aware of him, aware of what he had done. And now it was waiting. The 13th chime had come again. Ethan stood frozen in the dim hallway, clutching the journal his aunt had left behind, each word more disturbing than the last. He'd spent hours in the quiet corners of the house, unable to shake the sense that something was about to unfold, something that had been building for years. The clock had stopped ticking for a moment, and for the first time, there was complete silence. A suffocating, stifling quiet that weighed on him like a physical presence. And then, as if the house itself had been holding its breath, the 13th chime rang out once more. This time, the change was immediate. Behind him, the air shimmered. He turned slowly, the hairs on his neck standing up, as a door began to materialize in the hallway. But it wasn't the door from the previous nights, the one that led into the warped, shifting spaces. This one was different. It was heavier, more solid, as if it had always been there, waiting to be uncovered. His hand moved of its own accord, reaching toward the door, drawn by something he couldn't explain. He felt like he was moving through molosses, the air too thick to breathe, but he pressed on. The door swung open with a sound that seemed to vibrate through his very chest, and he stepped inside. The room beyond was familiar, too familiar. It was the dining room. The table was set exactly as it had been when he was a child. Dishes of food he remembered clearly, the same worn wooden chairs, the same faded tablecloth. But there was something wrong. The air was too cold, the light too dim. The walls seemed to pulse, as if they were breathing. And there, at the table, sat his family. But they weren't alive. Not anymore. The faces were pale, almost waxy, and their eyes were wide, vacant. There was no warmth in them. His parents, his grandparents, all the familiar faces from his youth, sat frozen in place. And as Ethan stepped closer, he saw that their mouths were moving, but the words didn't reach his ears. Then, suddenly, one of them turned to him, his great-grandfather, a man who had died years ago, his face twisted into a grotesque smile. "You were never meant to inherit this house, Ethan," the man's voice rasped, as if it came from miles away. "You were the offering." The words sent a chill through him, deep into his bones. He backed away, heart pounding in his chest, but the room seemed to stretch, the walls expanding and contracting like a living thing. The family remained seated, their eyes now following him with an unsettling, unblinking stare. His father's voice cut through the air, his tone low and disembodied. "The pact was made long ago. One of us must always remain here. Silence is the price for the rest of us." Ethan's knees went weak. He couldn't breathe. The house had been feeding on memories, on time, but now it was feeding on something else, him. His inheritance wasn't just the house, it was his soul. "Do you hear them, Ethan?" his mother's voice whispered, though she didn't move a muscle. "We all hear them. The voices from the past, from the ones who've come before. They never leave, not really. We're trapped in the silence." Ethan's mind reeled. He couldn't understand. Why had his aunt kept this from him? Why had she stopped feeding the clock? And what was this pact, this curse that tied his family to this house, to this place? A voice broke through his confusion, a whisper so soft it barely registered, but it made his blood run cold. "It's not just your family, Ethan. It's yours too." He turned, eyes wild, looking for the source. The voice had come from the far corner of the room, from a shadow that seemed to shift on its own. The figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. A woman. Her face was hidden in darkness, but Ethan could feel her presence, the weight of her gaze pressing down on him. "You're part of it now," she said, her voice like the wind through a cracked window. "You were always part of it." The room seemed to close in around him, the voices of his family growing louder, more insistent. The air was suffocating now, thick with the pressure of 100 years of silence, of secrets, of lies. And then the woman stepped fully into the light. It was his aunt. Her face was twisted, disfigured, as though time had eaten away at her very soul. Her eyes were hollow, her lips stretched into a grin that made his stomach churn. "You stopped beating the clock, Ethan. You've opened the door," she whispered, each word like a nail being driven into his chest. "And now you'll pay the price." Before he could respond, the door slammed shut behind him, trapping him in the room with the echoes of his family's voices. He was no longer in control. The pact had already been sealed. The 13th chime rang out with an unnatural reverberation, a low, guttural sound that seemed to shake the house to its very core. Ethan stood in the hallway, frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like an iron bar across his chest. The clock was alive again, alive, in a way that was far more terrifying than he could have imagined. Time, it seemed, had finally begun to buckle under the clock's unrelenting pull. He felt it first as a shift in the air, a subtle change like the pressure before a storm, then the unmistakable sense that something wasn't right. It was the space between seconds, the strange way the hallway around him seemed to stretch and warp. The walls were no longer as solid as they had once seemed. They flickered like shadows in the dim light, as though the house itself was breathing, expanding, collapsing in on itself. His heartbeat raced as he looked down at his watch. The hands didn't move. It wasn't that they had stopped. It was that they had reversed. The second hand was moving backward, pulling the minutes and hours with it. Ethan stumbled back, his throat dry. He couldn't breathe. And then he saw it. A shadow, thin and elongated, moved across the hallway, sliding against the grain of light, defying the natural course of things. It moved with purpose, a distorted reflection of reality. But it wasn't just the shadow. Something was with it, something tangible, something ancient. The air seemed to thick with its presence, like a fog that clung to his skin, making every breath feel like it was being drawn from deep underwater. The hallway stretched farther than it should have. Ethan's legs ached as he walked, but the space ahead of him only grew longer and longer. It was as if the hallway were endless now, as if it were becoming a living labyrinth that fed on his confusion. The walls pressed in on him, making the passageway feel like it was closing around him. The 13th chime had not only warped time, it was distorting reality itself. Ethan could see movement out of the corner of his eye, figures flickering in and out of existence. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but the longer he stared, the more he realized what he was seeing was real. Or at least, it felt real. Was he losing his mind? No, he knew what was happening. He was seeing himself. Not just any version of himself, past versions. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he stumbled backward, eyes wild. There, standing before him in the warped hallway, was his younger self, the one from just a few years ago. He looked no older than when he had first moved into the house. The boy stared back at him with wide, confused eyes, his face twisted in a mix of fear and recognition. But there was something wrong. The boy's hands were shaking, his lips parted as though he wanted to speak but couldn't. His eyes darted toward the doorway behind Ethan, as though he could see something there that wasn't visible to him. Then the door creaked open. Ethan spun around, his pulse quickening. His body tensed. The hallway stretched on behind him, but this door was different. There was a faint light coming from within, a hazy, glowing illumination that was impossibly wrong. It pulled at him, tugging at his very core, calling him. And then another figure stepped out of the door, a version of himself, older, bloodied, and bruised. This version of Ethan had scratches across his face, deep gouges that ran from his forehead down to his chin. His eyes were blackened, as though they'd been punctured, and the silence between them felt like it was filled with something unspeakable. This version of Ethan, he wasn't real, was he? He couldn't be. This had to be another distorted version of reality, one where time had twisted him into something else, something horrible. But then, the figure opened its mouth, and a low, raspy voice broke through the thick, oppressive silence. "You've opened the door, haven't you?" The voice rasped, a sound like the scrape of broken glass. "You've let them in." The words made Ethan freeze. He wanted to shout, to tell this distorted version of himself that it wasn't real, that none of this could be real, but he couldn't. He couldn't move. The door behind him swung wide open, revealing yet another version of himself, this time older still. Blood-soaked, his shirt torn, he limped toward Ethan with a horrific, broken smile. And behind him, another figure emerged, this one even more disfigured, one of Ethan's childhood friends, her face gouged out, her eyes gone, replaced by empty sockets. She reached out, her hands shaking as if she wanted to pull him into the doorway. The hallway was no longer a hallway. It was a passage into every version of himself he had ever been, a twisted, fractured representation of all the possibilities that had been locked away behind the door. Time had broken open like a cracked mirror, and now each piece of Ethan was scattered across the hall. But then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. The world held its breath, the air thick and oppressive. Time itself seemed to shudder, as though it were about to break apart completely. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the hallway expanded one last time. There was something beyond the door. Something that had been waiting for so long. Something that had been locked away for centuries. And it was about to escape. Ethan felt it first as a ripple in the air, a dark, slithering sensation that crawled across his skin. His stomach churned as the temperature dropped. The floor beneath his feet began to tremble, as if the house itself were shaking, as if it were about to collapse inward. Something was inside. The 13th hour was nearly over. The house was no longer a home. It was an entity breathing and pulsating with dark intent. The air around Ethan was thick with the stench of decay, and the walls seemed to lean in toward him, pressing tighter with every passing second. Time had folded in on itself, collapsing into the nightmarish reality that had been born from the 13th chime. He could feel the clock, its unyielding presence, every tick of its hands vibrating deep inside his chest, like the heartbeat of some ancient monster waiting to emerge. The door stood before him, wide open, the passage beyond a swirling vortex of light and darkness, a doorway that led not to a room, but to everything, to every moment, every twisted version of his own past, every possibility that had ever been. He could hear his own breath, shallow and quick, as the temperature in the hallway dropped, each exhale crystallizing in the frigid air. The clock behind him ticked relentlessly, its hands inching closer to midnight, to the final toll. Ethan's body trembled as he turned toward the open door, his heart pounding, every muscle screaming at him to run. But he couldn't. The door had become his only choice. It was a decision he had to make. There was no turning back. The room on the other side was darker than anything he had ever seen. The walls were covered in a velvet-like blackness, the air thick with something alive. The very floor seemed to pulse, undulating beneath his feet as though it was made of flesh, not wood. Shadows writhed in the corners of the room, swirling and stretching as if they were reaching for him. From the center of the room, there was a low hum, almost like a whisper, a voice too soft to understand. Ethan stepped forward, each footfall muffled by the strange air, as though the ground itself was swallowing him whole. And then, just as his foot crossed the threshold, the final chime rang. The clock's toll was deafening, shaking the very foundation of the house. The sound reverberated through Ethan's bones, rattling his insides, as if the world itself was about to tear apart. He collapsed to his knees, the weight of the sound pressing down on him. The walls around him began to shudder, and the air crackled with static, filling his ears with an overwhelming pressure. The clock was cracking. Through the chaos, Ethan heard something, or rather someone. It was a voice, his aunt's voice, soft and distant, like a memory drifting through a fog. "It's time, Ethan," she whispered. "The door is open. You've brought them back." The final chime echoed longer, sharper. And then there was a shift. The room around him seemed to distort, bending like liquid, as if time itself had come undone. The walls, once solid, now rippled, shifting and twisting, as if they were made of smoke. And in the center of it all, the clock began to break apart. Its wooden face splintered, the glass shattered, and the brass gears inside turned with a screeching, agonizing cry. Something was coming through. From the shattered remnants of the clock, a dark figure emerged. It was formless at first, a shadow, a black mist, writhing and curling in the air. But as it took shape, Ethan realized what it was. A mouth, an impossibly large, gaping maw had opened behind the glass, revealing rows upon rows of jagged teeth, gleaming and dripping with something dark and wet. The clock had never been a timepiece, it had been a gate. The figure in the center of the room, the thing that had been waiting, was now fully formed. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as it stepped forward. It was a silhouette of a man, tall, impossibly thin, with skin so pale it almost gleamed. His features were indistinct, his face a blur of shadows and light, but his eyes, they were the only thing Ethan could see clearly. They were dark, endless pits, drawing him in, consuming him with a gaze that was both familiar and foreign, as if he had seen them before. In the very depths of his own soul, he could feel the clock's pull now, the finality of it. Time had come full circle, and the end was near. The figure spoke, its voice like the grinding of stone against stone, deep and echoing, as though it came from somewhere beyond time itself. "You're the key, Ethan," it said, its words vibrating in his chest. "You've always been the offering, the final piece to unlock what's been waiting." Ethan staggered to his feet, his mind reeling, his body trembling with the weight of the truth. The clock had been feeding, not just on time, but on memories, on the lives of his family. And now it had fed enough. It had opened the door, and what lay beyond it was now clawing its way through. It had always been there, waiting, and now it was here. The figure reached out, its hand impossibly long, its fingers like twisted claws, but before it could touch him, Ethan took a step back. The floor beneath him groaned. The walls around him seemed to bend inward, as if the house itself was closing in. He had a choice. The figure's voice was now a hiss, its words sharp and insistent. "Seal it, Ethan. Seal the door. Keep it shut forever." Ethan's gaze flicked to the shattered clock, its hands still ticking, still counting down to nothing. And then he saw it. Behind the broken clock, behind the shadowy figure, there was another door. A door that hadn't been there before. A door that was closing. He knew what he had to do. Ethan rushed toward it, his heart racing, his hands shaking as he grasped the door's handle. He could feel the thing behind him, its presence growing, its power surging as the clock began to wind down to nothing. It was too late. The door was closing, but if he didn't act now, if he didn't seal it, forever, the world would be lost. With a final, desperate breath, Ethan slammed the door shut, locking it with every ounce of his strength. The room quaked, the air crackling with the intensity of what had been unleashed, but he held the door firm. The clock's final chime rang out one last time, and then there was silence. The house stood still. The air settled. The walls stopped breathing, and Ethan was alone. The clock had stopped. The door was sealed. The nightmare was over. But as Ethan stood there, gasping for breath, staring at the door he had closed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still waiting. Somewhere in the dark.